one statistic I think is shocking is that 80% of healthcare decisions are made by women, and yet only 4% of R&D focuses on women's health. We tend to be the doctors of our families. We make healthcare decisions for our children, our partners, our parents. We make appointments, we make purchasing decisions, and we're also much more likely to be caregivers if someone falls ill. But at the same time, we haven't designed the healthcare system. And oftentimes we're still excluded. Women and people of color were only officially included in clinical trials in 1993. And as a result of this omission, today, it's still the case that across 770 types of diseases, women are diagnosed an average of 4 years later than men, and out of 10 medications withdrawn from the market, 8 negatively affected women. We are nearly twice as likely to experience severe side effects from drugs. So there are many ways in which you could say that it is definitely unstable.
Unstable Vitals is the podcast that takes the pulse of American healthcare, and the prognosis is critical. Doctors Lara and Adam, former ER physicians turned entrepreneurs and business leaders, expose why the system is unraveling before our eyes. But all hope isn't lost. Lara and Adam cut through the noise, spotlighting what's failing, what's actually working, and what it will take to rebuild a system on the verge of collapse. Buckle up. This is the unfiltered, no BS conversation healthcare desperately needs.
Well, hello everyone. This is Dr. Adam Brown. I'm here with Dr. Lara Zibners, and we have another episode of Unstable Vitals. We have a very exciting show today where we are going to be talking with Dr. Marina Gerner. And I hope I said that right. Did I say that right?
Gerner, almost.
Gerner.
Oh man,
I'm right out of the bat. You fucked it up, right? Bro.
I totally
did.
No,
that's very common. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I know.
Let me do the intro. I'll step in.
Okay, just step in. I need a woman to help me out right now. Because I'm failing.
You need a woman to explain what's happening.
Go ahead.
Step aside, Dr. Brown.
Woman-splain me. Woman-splain me.
I'm going to woman-splain you. We are so excited today to have Marina Gerner, doctor, an award-winning financial journalist and columnist. She's covered in awards for her writing and has been seen pretty much everywhere, from The Economist to The Times to The Wall Street Journal. She started out as a financial reporter, but then shifted into women's health, and she penned an article for Wired that went viral called, "We Need to Talk About Investors' Problems with Vaginas." Here to talk about her new book, which I read, and it's sitting right behind me, The Vagina Business and Women's Health from a Financial Perspective, is Dr. Gerner. Hello, Marina.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the lovely intro.
Of course, and me screwing up your name right off the bat. I apologize for that.
That's fine. We've managed to woman-splain it to you, so it's all good.
Yes,
that's
okay,
right. And I'm excited because this is not there's lots of books out there that are very informative. This one's just a really great read. I did not know that when I had a uterus, it traveled around my body, causing all of my hysteria.
It doesn't? Explain that to me. I need to be a woman-splained again, So isn't that where the name hysterectomy came from? I mean, it removes the hysteria. Isn't that what the OBGYNs... Wait, that's not right. Whoa, if you're listening and you could feel the tension.
Feel Marina's look.
But if you can
Adam.
see it, okay, I'm ready.
Okay, tell us where the word hysterus came from.
Yeah, uterus from hysteria, as you have explained, and the idea was that the uterus was causing all sorts of health issues in women by wandering around our bodies. But yeah, I'm really glad you say that it's readable and engaging, because that was exactly my goal. Women's health can be a very heavy, complicated topic, and I wanted to keep people with me and take them on a journey and make sure that they come away feeling inspired and uplifted.
Yeah, there were some giggles in there for sure. So you did it. Job done.
Thank you.
The name of this podcast is Unstable Vitals. And one of the reasons why Lara and I created this podcast is we wanted to talk to people who were trying to solve the problems in healthcare that, as we see it, is unstable. There's access issues, there's price issues, there's definite issues in the business world with healthcare, and there's disparities, of course. So, I'm going to ask you, not is healthcare unstable, but is women's health unstable, domestically, globally? Can you expand on that?
Yes. I'm such an academic, so I'm going to say, unstable, what does it mean? It means it's likely to give way. It's not stable. It's likely to fail. It's not firmly established. And I think all of these things apply to women's health. One statistic I think is shocking is that 80% of healthcare decisions are made by women, and yet only 4% of R&D focuses on women's health. We tend to be the doctors of our families. We make healthcare decisions for our children, our partners, our parents. We make appointments, we make purchasing decisions, and we're also much more likely to be caregivers if someone falls ill. But at the same time, we haven't designed the healthcare system. And oftentimes we're still excluded. Women and people of color were only officially included in clinical trials in 1993. And as a result of this omission, today, it's still the case that across 770 types of diseases, women are diagnosed an average of 4 years later than men, and out of 10 medications withdrawn from the market, 8 negatively affected women. We are nearly twice as likely to experience severe side effects from drugs. So there are many ways in which you could say that it is definitely unstable. There are 5 times more studies focused on erectile dysfunction than PMS, despite the fact that only 19% of women have ED, while over 90% of women report symptoms of PMS.
Wow. Okay, so that makes me feel bad. That makes me feel awful.
And you should.
It does. I mean, you listen to these numbers and these statistics, and it's just staggering. And I think one of the numbers that sticks out to me is, what did you say, 1992?
1993, yeah.
Or three, that women and people of color were added into a lot of the research that was done. And I think, from just kind of stepping back as a doctor, you realize so many of the old medicine that we learned. And Lara and I are getting longer in the tooth when it comes to our medical practice. So, if you go back to when we went to medical school, we were learning medicine off of research done basically on males, not being done on women.
I used my dad's gross anatomy book, and my dad graduated from medical school in 1967.
Wow.
So I'm even a little more outdated, right? Like, I had to get the updated version, but just for comparison, I saw, and even in that time there was a shift, but we still weren't talking about women in the same way. But I think what was interesting, Marina, because you talk a lot about it in your book, and I found it very informative. Can you explain why the gender gap in research and medicine existed? Because it really started as a way to protect women when doctors were paternalistic, right?
Yeah, exactly. It happened in the wake of a few medical scandals like the thalidomide scandal. So it was a series of tragedies that led to the exclusion of women from clinical trials. The drug thalidomide was widely used to treat morning sickness, which I'm sure is a term we all hate. It was used to treat morning sickness in pregnant women across Europe, and scientists did not realize that the drug could pass through the placenta to reach the fetus. And so, unfortunately, this drug led to severe birth defects in over 10,000 babies. And so there was, some could say it was a reasonable reaction. Some would say it was an overreaction, but it was basically decided that because of our childbearing potential, women would be excluded, even though the wording actually said women of childbearing potential should be excluded from the earliest dose ranging studies. So, in other words, if drugs did well in previous rounds, women could have still been included, but the guidelines were widely misinterpreted to mean exclusion of all women from all clinical trials. And so nowadays researchers said that we have protected women from research rather than with research, and we're still trying to catch up to fill those gaps retrospectively. And unfortunately, we still haven't reached parity in terms of inclusion.
Well, wasn't it also because having women just made it more work? Because our hormones fluctuate, because they would have had to, it could have confounded some of the variables. I love the part where you talk about the boy mice and the female mice and how female mice were excluded from studies because they were more erratic, but actually it was because their cages were more difficult to clean, and the boy mice's
Yeah,
mice,
that
I
was
can't talk.
no, that was a really interesting point. That was an excuse that was cited in one of the journal articles that excluded female mice. The researchers, they were not embarrassed to say, "Oh, we've excluded female mice because their cages were harder to clean." Like that's simply an excuse. And then in terms of hormones, like yes, it could mess up otherwise neat results, but that's not always the case. Some studies on mice have shown that their female mice are actually less erratic in some ways. So it depends. And either way, if you're not doing the research beforehand, then real life women will end up paying the price further down the line.
Right. And we're not mice. We also have to, be able to include human women in these studies too. But just to say that it goes all the way back to kind of those early animal models where they just go for male sex animals because it's easier.
You had brought up something, I think, when we were talking about is women's health unstable and the notion of giving way. I like that just simplicity in the way that you describe that. And so Laura mentioned, the paternalistic nature of women's health, even going back centuries about the whole idea of the uterus and what the role of that is. You're now mentioning some of the issues of why it's unstable because of research and the disparity and inclusion with women in research because of multiple different, sometimes often ridiculous reasons. What are some of the other causes that you believe are kind of perpetuating the instability in women's health?
And maybe one thing to say is, it's not just historic. So even nowadays, when you look at something like Ozempic, right, 1 in 8 Americans has taken it. And suddenly, a few years ago, there were all these reports of women having surprise pregnancies, even though they were on the pill or they had infertility issues. And suddenly, they were taking Ozempic and they're getting pregnant. And so the question is, what does Ozempic do to boost fertility? And there are a few explanations because it changes how the pill is absorbed into the bloodstream, for example. But there hasn't been any conclusive research on this. And how can it be that such a popular drug and its effect on the female body is just an afterthought? And that's happening right now. We're not talking about 3 decades ago.
Right.
But yeah,
Very true.
research is one big issue, and then funding is the other big issue that's really underlying everything, because to do research, you need to have funding as well. But unfortunately, women's health is still underfunded.
Why? Why do you? What are the kind of the reasons why you think that academically, why is it underfunded? And I mean, we see what's happening with our current administration in the United States, and so with funding. But let's even take it, preceding the most recent, change in the administration. It was underfunded before, so why?
Yeah, so I should say I focused on the VC world because that was one of the things that got me into this topic was the article that you mentioned called "We Need to Talk About Investors' Problem with Vaginas." And that was when I was talking to a variety of vagina-centric companies, and I heard from founders again and again that they're struggling to raise money because the vast majority of investors are male, something like 90% of VC investors. And not only can they not relate to the problem because they don't have any skin in the game, literally, but they also don't want to talk about vaginas in a business setting because they're embarrassed by it. And there's a lot of stigma around these topics. And so as a result, they don't invest in the innovation that we clearly need and want and deserve. But that bias is everywhere, not just in the VC world, unfortunately.
You know, my company does vaginal drug delivery, and I had to learn quite early on. Adam and I talked a lot about it, and something we hit on that really works is to relate everything to nasal drugs. Because if you put it in the context of something men understand, like, perfume related to cologne and aftershave, right? Like, we have to find way, and that's really not fair. We shouldn't have to do this. But I have found, as your book mentioned, it helps to lean in. Like, I can walk into a room with investors, and I'm 53 years old and I have a doctorate and 2 masters. So I can frighten them right off the bat with that. And then I can say the word vagina, vagina, vagina. And
Yes.
I don't really care, and I lean into it, but I do relate it to something that men understand. Because one of the things you mentioned, which irks me, is the I need to go home and ask my wife. I'm like, there's no female investor who deals with anything that is male related who says I need to go home and ask my husband. You make financial decisions not based on what your
One
wife
person.
thinks.
Yeah.
Right.
But also, you wouldn't ask one person. You wouldn't invest in space and say, hey, let me go ask one astronaut. You would look at the total addressable market. You would look at the
Right.
unmet need, at the business model, and so on. You wouldn't just ask one person. So this is a very particular hurdle in the women's health space.
So you mentioned something, and I'm picking up on something from what you both are saying is this necessity to create relatable storytelling communications to whomever your potential investors may be. So if you're sitting in a room of women investors that happen to be, which doesn't happen that often, but you pull a bunch of women investors all together at some conference, your communication around your drug delivery device or a women's health issue or a women's health funding opportunity would likely be very different than a conversation around men, to the point of relatability. So is that right? Or is that just what it is right now, and we have to get to a point later on down the road where it becomes more equitable or equal?
For now, it's a fact. It's something I hear from every entrepreneur, and I think Lara's example with the nasal spray is brilliant. And I have many other examples in the book of, how do you explain a hot flash? And the entrepreneur I spoke to, she says it's like having a near accident and then your nervous system gets activated. And so you're trying to describe it in a way that everyone else can try and imagine. Relatability is a really interesting one because it's something that's expected of women more broadly. Female cartoon characters are expected to be relatable, unlike male cartoon characters. So it's an interesting one.
Can I pull on that thread just one more point? It is the idea about relatability. My assumption is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you go in, let's take any innovation, and you go and you speak to a group of investors. The people who are more likely to invest or get behind it, become the champions, are those who get excited about the issue. And that's where the excitement and relatability comes. And so that's what I'm assuming there. So is there an issue then with truly getting to men who are most commonly your investors at current state, how to get them excited? How are you getting them excited? And is that part of the problem? Is it all misogyny, or is it or is it bias, or is it a confluence of all of those things? Pick on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all of these things. And oftentimes we think that people make financial decisions rationally, right? But we don't. We all know this. And investors are not immune to that either. And they like to invest in products and services that they can use themselves, or maybe their wife or their daughter or their sister can use it, to a point where I tell the story in the book where I was at a press dinner and there was an investor next to me who was praising this company he had invested in that's producing dog food. And he was saying, oh, it's so great. No matter what economic environment there is, people will always buy food for their beloved dogs. And then he got up to go to the bathroom, and his colleague says to me, "Oh, ever since he got a puppy, he's been banging on about this dog food company." And so it's oftentimes really, really personal. And I think the underlying factor below many of these threads that you've pulled together is that we have normalized female pain throughout history and as a society. Whether that's period pain, we say, oh, that's normal. Pain with breastfeeding, just wait a few months, it might get better. Painful IUD insertions to the point where people are fainting. Well, it's worth it because then you have an IUD. So I think we need to, and birth is probably one of the best examples of that. We need to get to a point where we say, hang on, we need to stop saying welcome to being a woman and just suck it up, and we need to come up with better solutions instead. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm highlighting the work of those people who lead the way with that and who have come up. Oh, sorry, there's a thunderstorm in the background here.
I thought that was my son. I've gone all the way to your house. Well, so we really jumped ahead and dove into the meat of this, but can we back up, because we said you were a doctor, but you're not the kind of doctor that answers the call for a doctor on an airplane, are you? Can you back up and tell us a little bit about your background and how you even got into this space?
Yes, absolutely, I can. So I have a PhD in social sciences. I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm a journalist. As a journalist, I've covered a really broad range of topics from technology to finance and health and culture. And I also have a side hustle as an adjunct professor at the NYU Stern School of Business. So I teach culture and business there. And I have multiple origin stories, but I'll tell you one of them. I was in my early 30s when I started writing about these topics, and I knew that I wanted to have children soon. I also knew that 9 in 10 first-time mothers experience a birth injury, and that was really shocking to me to know this statistic and to know how normalized this is as well. It's something people don't really talk about a lot of the time. It feels like there's this secret society. If you're not part of it, you're not being told anything about it. And I think partly the attitude is to say, oh, she hasn't given birth yet. Don't put her off. Don't tell her anything. You might scare her. Whereas I prefer to know what might happen. I prefer to do my research. So I was looking into how to prevent this, and I found this company in California called Materna Medical, and they've created a birth dilator, which is not on the market yet. It's in clinical trials, but the idea is to pre-stretch the muscles of the vaginal canal in the first stage of labor so that by the time the baby comes through, hopefully you're less likely to experience tearing, less likely to experience urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse later down the line. And when I did research in that space, I realized that the last big innovation in the standard of care of birth was the epidural, which was popularized in the 1950s. And that blew my mind because I thought there's no other area of society or technology where we bring something out from the 1950s and we say, hey, look, this is the best option we got. Look at this cutting edge floppy disk. But in the birth space, that's exactly what we do. And the forceps is from the 17th century, and it's basically a set of salad forks. And then vacuum delivery is basically a toilet plunger. So we're using these tools that are very, very
You're right.
They're basic. And I was on a panel next to a gynecologist, and she was like, yeah, I use the salad forks and the toilet plunger every day. And obviously that's not the fault of practicing professionals. It's a systemic issue that our tools are still basic. And I think we just need to see much, much more innovation in the space. And then I realized, okay, funding is the main hurdle. And partly that's because there's not enough pattern recognition, but also because there's a stigma and there's a taboo around these things, and because we have normalized female pain. And to come back to your question about storytelling, one thing I think about a lot is how do we make this topic cool? How do we get people to see this whole space in a new light? One thing, and maybe you have some thoughts on this as well, But I was speaking at South by Southwest in Austin a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of hype around a company called Colossal Biosciences. Have you heard of them?
No.
Okay, so they have a valuation, a multi-billion-dollar valuation. I don't remember exactly. They've raised like $500 million or something. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to revive the mammoth and other
Yes, I've
extinct
heard about that. And they did the
species.
woolly mouse, right? They've got the woolly mouse. It's the cutest little thing.
Well,
Have you seen the woolly mouse?
I have not. I'm sure it's very cute, but then, I can just imagine those investors sitting at a dinner party somewhere, and somebody says, "Hey, what do you do?" And they'll go, "You know what I do? I'm helping to revive the mammoth."
The Tyrannosaurus Rex, because it's cool. I mean, like,
I saw that movie. It didn't work out.
yeah.
Right, somebody should tell them, right? But you can just picture it. And how do we get to a place where those same people will be sitting there and bragging, what I do? I help over 50% of the population not be traumatized by giving birth. Like, how do we get to that place where that's aspirational and cool and the priority?
I think that is such an important question because, I can see it. I can see, especially with this like toxic masculinity culture that is developing and growing. And I shouldn't say it's developing. It's been there, but it's being engendered and being pushed. You see it in a lot of media now. You see it in social media, TikTok, etc. When people go down these algorithms, not saying that, rebirthing or resurrecting literally the woolly mammoth is kind of toxic masculinity. But when you say, okay, people sitting around a dinner party basically going in the one-upsmanship of, oh, this is what I did, that goes back into the toxicity. And so I'm not suggesting that we need to insert women's health into toxic masculinity, but what at all. But what I mean, it's a phenomenal kind of point. And really that, I believe, just my opinion, is a big source of issue that we have to solve is how do you make it, just to what you said, how do we make women's health investment cool? And what is it going to take? Like, how do we crawl into the mind, Professor? How do we crawl into the minds of doctors, but innovators, investors, and make it really cool? That's going to make them sit around that dinner party or at Thanksgiving or where have you and say, I have a business that supports vagina health, or vaginal health, or birthing. How do you do that?
Yeah.
It's been
exactly.
a rhetorical question, maybe, but
yeah. Well, I'm trying to change the narrative with the book. That's my obvious answer. I'm telling all of these success stories to say to people, investors, and I don't think it necessarily has to be toxic. Talking about what you do in that way. I think that can just be an open conversation. But women's health is just never perceived in that way, or so far it hasn't been. And how can we make it so? Because unfortunately, historically, it's often been the case that whenever something is associated with women, no matter how important it is to the world, whether it's care work, looking after children, looking after parents, we see this in the publishing world with romance and romantic fiction. Why does that have to be called chick lit or whatever rather than serious literature? So whenever something's associated with women, it's seen as frivolous or non-essential or soft or extra, or too much, including the word vagina itself. So how do we shift that narrative, or how do we at least draw attention to it so that people go, something's not quite right, we need to address that?
It's interesting you say that because I get kind of my nose bent out of shape just with the term women's health, because there's nothing that affects half the population without affecting the other half. And my co-founder's a man, and he takes some crap now and again for being a dude in women's health, as if women own it just
Right.
because the pendulum went so far that way. We can't have everybody. I say, they are fathers and brothers and husbands and sons. They deserve to have their pain recognized and be part of this conversation. But it's, to your point, Adam, it's not cool dude talk.
Yeah, and it's how we all got here as well, right? No matter who you are, that's
right.
how you got here.
Exactly. One of the crazy things as I'm kind of listening to all this is that, if we were doing research on cardiovascular disease, we don't necessarily call it men's disease. It's kind of across the whole human spectrum of like, we're looking at cardiovascular disease. If I were to say at a dinner party, I am working on prostate health, people would be like, ooh, but if I turn that into like, I'm looking at ovarian health, or I'm looking at, something like that, people would give me a look and a pause.
Right.
And it's really unfortunate because, as people who want to help advance the health of other people in general, there's no other better way than to advance 50% of the world's population by focusing on issues that are health-related issues to birthing, or the uterus, or the vagina, or breast health, or all of those different things. So it's very interesting. This is absolutely fascinating.
Well, it's back to the point that I thought of, and Adam and I were talking about when I was reading, that why do we describe women's chest pain as atypical when that is very typical for half the population on how it presents? Why? Because it's not atypical. It's perfectly typical for people who have that extra part of the chromosome that men are missing.
Yeah, I was actually having the exact same thought. I was thinking heart health is the perfect example, because the symptoms that most of us think of when we imagine someone having a heart attack are, pressure on the chest and pain radiating down the left-hand side. And those are typical for men. They're not typical for women. And so women are much more likely to have things like long-term fatigue, jaw pain, nausea. And so the female symptoms are considered atypical. And that's just, it's mind-blowing. And when I ask anyone, who's the person you see? If you're asked to imagine someone who's having a heart attack, who do you see? Everyone says an old man. Like, that is the image everybody has.
Which, that's also that is such a good, very easy to understand thing, because I think all of us jump into our own bias, our unconscious bias, and immediately think of a man. I'll tell you, as an ER doctor, I've had so many patients that the patients do not read the textbooks, which is sometimes a good thing, because the textbook
so
in and of
annoying.
itself is, I know, right?
Annoying.
Like it's but the textbooks are, again, based upon a lot of bias and studies that didn't include, a large portion of the population. But I'll never forget, I had a patient one day that, there's this little spidey sense that was like, okay, she's come in with like a couple of episodes of feeling lightheaded and dizzy. She has occasional like shortness of breath. Maybe I should check a troponin. Maybe I should do like not just say, oh, it's nothing. And sure enough, like the troponin was through the roof. And so you do. And I had another patient that I could just, nothing was typical, but something said, oh, it bothered me. I'm going to check a D-dimer to make sure she doesn't have a pulmonary embolism. And sure enough, she had a whopping bilateral, both of her lungs, pulmonary emboli sitting in there. And she had none of the classic symptoms that we are oftentimes told. And so, it's unfortunate that sometimes in medicine we have to depend on that spidey sense. But if you're overly biased and you're not thinking that way and you're thinking through typical, you're going to miss a lot of those things.
Yeah, that's an amazing example.
So I have you have a couple of quotes that I just thought in the book that were really interesting, and I wanted you to kind of just give me a little commentary, and then I have a question. You had a quote in here that says, "I don't want to talk about vaginas in my Monday morning partner meeting." I'm assuming that was something that was directly that was something you heard from venture capitalists, that that they did not want to have that conversation. So how do we incorporate a more honest dialogue? Do we talk in dollars? Do we talk in numbers? Like, how do we get people to say, I want to talk about vaginas in my Monday morning partner meeting?
Yeah. So I
I
teach.
don't know.
Yeah.
Do
Go
we
on.
want them actively going out just to talk about vaginas? No, we want to talk about women's health, right?
Yes, exactly.
Just don't be afraid to say the word vagina on a Monday
Yeah.
morning.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm being a
Yeah.
little hyperbolic.
Yeah. No, I teach business students actually on a Monday oftentimes. And so I come in and the first time I meet them, I immediately talk about my work and I say vagina as much as possible. And people initially they giggle. There's a bit of like, oh, but then they get used to it within minutes. And I think if we just normalize the word and destigmatize the word, that will be super helpful. And somebody said to me recently, like, I'm sure those same guys have no problem sitting there talking about pussy, in a different context. And you're like, oh yeah, there's something in that. But I think normalizing the word, talking about data, talking about the unmet needs, the business case, all of those things are hugely important.
Does it start even earlier? Meaning, I remember in high school, the boys were separated from the girls on health. So it was like, these are boys' issues, these are girls' issues. And there was this mystery around what's happening in the girls' discussion.
Yeah.
Are they talking about us? Are they not? Like, what is the conversation? There was all of this mystery. So does that imprintment, I guess, of lack of better terms, does that start all the way back into there? And that is one of the reasons why we have the stigma that we have.
100%. It has to start with education. Otherwise, you have no foundation to understand these issues and talk about them. And why do they get separated into groups? These are things that concern all of us, as we have said. So
I will say when my son was in kindergarten, he had to do a Venn diagram of boys and girls, and then where the circles intersected both, and he had to put the body parts. So I there's a change afoot. I mean, he got some of them wrong, which we had to talk about. But I think there is a change to bring some of that together and less of the separation. But I was certainly part of that group where the boys went with the girl teacher and the girls went with the female teacher and the boys went with the male teacher. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, I see that as kind of a antecedent to a lot of this for a long time, is that this separation of like, this is your health, this is my health. We're not going to talk about them because this doesn't apply, when in reality it does. Do you find with your business school students, you said that they start to get more used to vaginas discussion. Are you seeing them do projects? Are you seeing them incubate projects and innovations around women's health more in your time? You're at Stern. Are you seeing that shift?
Oh, definitely. I think the whole topic of women's health, it's just put on their radar, but that's because of my specific work, because I bring that to my students, and then they do focus their projects on it. They apply for internships that are related to it, including related to the investment world, because I kind of demystify the investment world to them and show them how it's a fascinating space and a powerful space to be part of. So oftentimes they'll apply for internships that are related, and also the way that they interpret things is also influenced by that.
So on from that, because we talked a little bit about like the biases and misconceptions, but you dedicate a fair amount of the book to talking to the bad actors, and I think that is another way in which these biases are created, because so much has changed already. Like LV, well, you wrote about it in the first few pages of the book, and now it's already been acquired by Willow in what was not a great success story. So that right there is a cautionary tale for people looking at women's health. But then we've got the Gwyneth Paltrow's, my least favorite celebrity on the planet, telling everyone to steam their vaginas when your vagina does not need to be. I believe you pointed out that asparagus is an item that benefits from steaming. The vagina does not. So
Yes.
the fact that the whole field has been opened up to companies looking to commercialize and get rich fast off of women's health, menopause. Menopause is not a berry deficiency, right? But plenty of supplements are out there telling me it is.
Yes.
Right? So can you talk, I really appreciated your commitment to sticking to the science in there, but what do you think that does to the overall playing field?
Yeah. So I think what's fascinating is that there's this gap that has opened up between, the experience of patients and the healthcare system, and then who steps into that gap. Both people who innovate and try to change things, but also bad actors who, as you say, see an opportunity to make money. And sometimes what's interesting is that those bad actors actually take female pain seriously because they see it as a financial opportunity. So they're like, oh, we could sell a sugar pill for that. Whereas maybe some medical professionals, that just gaslight people. So there's something interesting in that. But there are lots of snake oil vendors, and I distinguish between femtech, so female technology focused on women's health that's making a positive contribution, and scam tech, companies that are not backed
Oh,
by
that's great.
evidence. And there's a lot in the menopause space. Supplements are a good example for that. There are also companies that are basically a new form of the pink tax. So, the pink tax and how pink razors are sold to women at a premium compared to blue razors that are sold to
And
men.
they're the same.
Yes, exactly. They do the same thing. And so we have examples of ibuprofen being repackaged as
Yes.
Feminax or period pain, and
Yes.
that's sold at a premium. Or and that's a more nuanced example, but TENS machines, for example, being redesigned and then sold at a 300% premium for period pain. Vagina steaming is one of the really dangerous devices
right.
out there, and
So I should not steam my penis, is what you're saying. There
No,
should not
no, no. In fact, yeah, I know. I did a post recently on Instagram about what steaming is good for, and it's like good for choo-choo trains, and it's good for broccoli. It's good for your wedding dress. It is not good for your nether regions. You can if I have a cold, sometimes I'll steam my nose, but that's where I draw the line.
yeah, I like how you always come back to the nose. I like that. The nasal spray, the nose steaming.
Everything's back to the nose. Very
So good.
important.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is. It really is. But yeah, steaming, douching, all of these things are really dangerous and can cause everything from BV to adverse pregnancy outcomes. And the devices that I wrote about, some of them are on Kickstarter. So I've gone onto actual Kickstarter pages to get some of their quotes, and I give people a range of questions they can ask themselves when they're considering a product to try and see, if it's evidence based, or something that's often a red flag is if it plays on your emotions, if it causes a strong emotional reaction, like you're running out of eggs, quick, quick, quick. You need this product, yeah. So there are many red flags to look out for, and something that's very simple to do if you're downloading an app, for example, is to Google the name of the app together with a word like scandal or court case or data leak or privacy issue, and then see what comes up, because there's such a range of companies in this space and there are real quality differences between them. So looking into what's behind a product or an app that you're considering can be beneficial.
So, we could sit here and talk about this for hours, but I think at some point you have to go to your little one, don't you?
I do.
Yeah. So I've got then kind of a last question is, okay, so we've talked about a lot of the issues with funding, some of the bias, the research, the way we communicate. What are you kind of looking forward? What are 2 or 3 things, almost in bullet points, I guess, that we need to do as a society, as business leaders, because we are business leaders? What do we need to do to start to change the narrative, to have more focus for investors into into the women's health space, even though we don't love using that term, but in the women's health space?
Yeah, I think the main way to overcome stigma is to talk about things. So, exactly what we're doing here right now and what all the listeners are part of. So to take these conversations and talk to the people in your life. Some of the most powerful feedback I get from readers is when people say, you've made me reconsider how I talk to my daughter, or, I finally had a conversation with my mother about something we've only used euphemisms for before. So I think that's the most powerful thing. We've already spoken about sex education as the foundation, and being aware of each other's anatomy and so on. And I think one thing that's very simple that could make a huge difference, I think, is if everybody could draw a clitoris.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I say this because if you go to public bathrooms all around the world, you see doodles of penises everywhere, right? We have that visual language, but almost nobody can draw a clitoris. And I think if we start
Well,
with
most
that,
men can't find it.
Well, and I was going to say the penis and its little associated balls is so ridiculous looking, just as a flappy thing, that you can't help but make fun of it. But most people don't even realize the clitoris is shaped like a big, like turkey wishbone.
yes, with
Right?
bulbs.
You only
Yes.
see a little bit of it.
Yes, exactly. It's actually huge under the skin and it hugs the vaginal canal, and it's really fascinating. And I think we need the visual language as well as having the words and the business case and the research.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. One I know that we could go on about. It kind of ended with a bang, I will say. I wasn't expecting
It was a real
that, Marina.
climax.
It was a real climax, a big poo, like I was not. I wasn't expecting like one of the solutions was draw the clitoris,
I think we just solved the world's problems right there.
I think it's not a bad idea at all.
Thank you.
I think it's a great idea. Well, listen, this is, again, this is a really great discussion about how we can start to shift the narrative, get more funding into women's health because lives do depend on it. Half of the world's population are women. And because there is such little funding and such little focus and still a hell of a lot of stigma, we really are harming such a huge swath of the population of the world. So I appreciate all of the work that you are doing, especially as a business school professor as well. Those minds are so important. Lara was one of my students. So those minds are so important to shape. And so I love that about reaching that impact, that exponential impact. So Dr. Gerner, thank you so much for joining us on Unstable Vitals. Lara, last words?
Where can we find your book? Everywhere, right?
Yes.
I've got the European UK copy. You've got the US version behind you. Amazon. You have a website. It's not hard to find. I strongly encourage people who are curious about this space to take a look.
Or your local bookstore as well. They should be able to order it. You could go in and you can say, where is the Vagina Business? Why is it not in the window? Because some bookshops have actually refused to display it, which is a whole other story. But
that's for the next episode. Oh my God. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Marina.
And have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. On behalf of Lara and me, take care. Have a good one. Stay stable.
Thanks for tuning in to Unstable Vitals. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us for more unfiltered conversations on the pulse of healthcare. Connect with us on LinkedIn or visit unstablevitals.com to stay in the loop. And don't forget, real change starts with real talk. See you next time.